The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to HEXAGON's webinar, Project Portfolio Management in Changing Market Conditions. We appreciate you taking the time to join us. I'm Mike Pappas, Associate Director of Deployment for the Construction Industry Institute, and I'm glad to introduce Mark Nelson from CII member company HEXAGON. Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for joining today. Let me talk a little bit about who HEXAGON is, and then we'll jump right into the webinar. So HEXAGON is, we establish technology solutions in information technology and that improve productivity and quality. We have about 18,000 employees globally and a strong focus on R&D with about 10 to 12% of our net sales going to R&D on an annual basis. I am personally within the HEXAGON PPM banner, which develops the majority of our software solutions, focused on capital project execution, design, construction, fabrication, and other operations. And I personally, my role at HEXAGON PPM is I am on the go-to-market team for EcoSys, which is an enterprise project performance tool. And we will talk a little bit about portfolio management today. So Mike did a nice job already introducing me, but I've been working in enterprise project performance for about 15 years. Started on the software implementation side, business process consulting, done a little bit of everything from pre-sales to sales as well. Now I'm focused on product direction and own the portfolio management piece of our enterprise project performance tool, EcoSys. But I'm not here today to really talk about that. I'm here to talk about how to leverage portfolio management to deal with the unexpected. So 3 things I really wanted to focus on today are why should we do portfolio management? I think probably a lot of us know that answer, have that answer, but it's good to be reminded because it's often a very difficult thing to pull off to have a solid portfolio management process. It takes a lot of effort, there's a lot of moving parts, and I want to talk a little bit about that today. I want to move on to talking about what makes a good portfolio management process and why are there challenges, and ultimately why we should continue to work through those challenges and the benefits it gives us, which is going to be the focus of the third part of the presentation today, which is how having a solid or strong portfolio management process supports us changing direction. And as we get into it, I'll explain that. I think having a solid portfolio management process inherently has built into it the ability to pivot and change, and that's kind of what we're going to focus on today. So with that, let's talk a little bit about why should we do portfolio management process. PMI says it's a centralized management of one or more portfolios that enable executive management to meet organizational goals and objectives through efficient decision-making on portfolios, projects, programs, and operations. And it sounds well and good, and I'll try to break that down into its component parts as we get into the presentation. So why portfolio management? So in a McKinsey study done a few years back, I think in 2018, what they found was that by choosing the right projects and having a good portfolio balance, so we'll talk a little bit about portfolio balance as well and what we mean by that. And then by choosing those right projects and eliminating wasteful or low value projects can give you some tremendous returns. It's going to be a recurring theme throughout the presentation today that having the right funds, the right investments, and the right people working on your high value projects is critical to high performing organizations. And trying to avoid those pet projects, non-strategic projects that suck up a lot of those resources is very important. Also, getting things on time and on budget, critical to all of us in this space, are also highly dependent on having the right mix of projects that are properly resourced. So in a study done by PMI with effective portfolio management, 36% of the projects deliver more on time and 19% more on budget. And finally, before we get into the meat of it, in portfolio management, it's key that it supports your strategy. And so you're aligning your portfolio of projects to whatever strategy you've undertaken. And the strategy is a deliberate search for a plan of action. So it's exploring white spaces. Where do we want to play? Where do we want to avoid? What's strategic for us? What's not strategic for us? So, and it often is a mix. It's not just all about the financials in a lot of cases. It's about trying to conquer a market space, play where you have advantages, avoid where you don't have advantages. So it's not necessarily always the most financially attractive project in the shorter term. So what will this get us? Ideally, you're going to be more focused on the projects that provide the highest value or are worth your resources and money and your investments. Planning for events that are within our control. So we were talking a little bit about how to pivot when things are not within your control, but you should have a good solid plan of events that are within your control so that when things do happen or you do have challenges or there are challenges in the market or through external forces, you can pivot ideally. So take a look at what projects you have, what projects still provide value, and move on from projects or delay projects where there is no shorter term value. Or it may not be moving on from those projects. It may be just diverting resources from some projects to other projects that due to the changes in the portfolio. Ideally, you would want to also, with a strong process, anticipate events you can't control. It could be a global pandemic. It could be a drop in oil prices. Could be a change in other major changes in other commodities or resource shortages. But strong proponents, practitioners of portfolio management are trying to, as much as they can, anticipate those in their planning sessions. One thing I wanted to point out is I'm not going to go into a lot. We don't have time to go into a lot of depth today, but I think something that would be great for everyone to take a look at, and we will make these, I believe we're going to make the slides available, is that CII did a real nice, put together some real nice papers, I believe it was 2 or 3 years ago, on managing a portfolio of projects, and then also identifying KPIs, key KPIs or metrics for improvement, and then walking through a process from their perspective. So I think it's a good resource. I encourage you to go out there and take advantage of that. Okay, so what are the elements of a good portfolio management process, and where do we see challenges? So this is a pretty typical example of a portfolio management process. So you can see I've got it as a pyramid here. So at the bottom, we have weekly or regular project level reviews. So everyone, project managers, project teams are reviewing KPIs on a regular basis, tracking progress, making sure they're tracking to be successful, and identifying risks, and so on and so forth. And this is done at a project level, and it should be bottoms-up communication. Now, at the portfolio level or top-down, there's typically an annual planning process. And I'll spend a little more time talking about things like cadence and what goes into that process here shortly. But ideally, these are providing strategies, investments, identifying what projects are going to receive resources, what projects are not going to be, they're not going to go forward with, but ideally understanding what your options are and making the best selection of projects based on strategy, goals, and whatever business benefits you might be looking to achieve. So there's a natural synergy. It's a back and forth. So in order to really understand where you have opportunities to take on new projects, you need to understand what the current state of your projects are. So you need to understand weekly project reviews. You need to understand gator approval meetings. So what have you committed to and over what time frame? So that those should actively give you a good feel for that. And then there should, I say quarterly portfolio reviews. I don't want to be too prescriptive, but you need to track your portfolio throughout the year and understand how you're performing against your portfolio. And if market conditions change or something changes, do regular reviews. I personally think quarterly makes sense for some businesses, not for other businesses. But at least do another review throughout the year. So I've seen semi-annually is also a pretty common way to do that. So what goes with creating a portfolio strategy? So what should you be tracking? So it is a fairly major exercise that for many organizations who are on a calendar year, that process will be starting up here in the next couple of months. It's very common, as I'm sure many of you know, to be defining your strategy or your annual plan in mid to late Q3, because that's got to be finalized in Q4. But that does include identifying, where do you want to play from a portfolio perspective, and what projects, what resources do you have available? What do you want to do with those resources next year? How will we meet our financial targets? How are we going to allocate our resources, being people or capital? And I think one thing that is not always easy to do and sometimes is overlooked, how do we have a good balance in our portfolio? Not play too heavily in one area so that if something goes wrong in that area or sector, it's significant risk. So having a good balance and defining what that balance is. And then making sure those priorities are communicated to the entire organization. I think that's another thing that is often overlooked a bit, making sure that everyone's on board with what the strategy is and what the goals are. One thing that was mentioned on the previous slide was constraints. So we all have constraints: financial, resources, people, facilities. We all have constraints. So having, again, a good understanding of what those constraints are will help you build out investment scenarios that best support your strategy. And typically, there's a corporate strategy, and then depending on the organization, there may be specific strategies within BUs and even divisions under that. And it can differ quite a bit as to whether the divisions or BUs have free reign to do whatever they want with their with whatever funds are being allocated. Typically not, but in some cases I've seen it where that they do have some leeway to go after specific sectors or projects without approval from corporate. But these are a top-down approach. So this is, again, what's coming down from the top down. We have our constraints and targets. We have our expected business benefits that are coming from the top. So let's talk a little bit about the cadence or how does the process play out. So I talked about quarterly reviews, but I also readily admitted that a lot of companies don't do quarterly reviews. They do semi-annual reviews, but there is a cadence with that, and there are different players in the process. So project teams, they're providing that bottoms-up data. So in order to do effective portfolio management, you need to understand what resources are being used for projects that have already been approved, and you need to understand how they're performing ideally. So the project teams are primarily focused on project lists and business cases, whereas your executives they're approving projects and resources, and they're more interested in what the bottom line financials are and potentially what the market opportunities are. So why do we go to all this trouble? We go to all this trouble, and I've talked about the process, and now I've laid the process out here in a little more a phase type approach. So it is not a 4-stage process. It's I think of it more of a circle. You're continually planning, you're continually evaluating projects, prioritizing, reprioritizing, and then implementing your projects, and that feeds into the next cycle. But the real benefits you're getting out of this is you're starting to make more objective decisions based on standard business cases, and business cases will convey benefits. They're also common with portfolio management or scorecards where you are leveraging industry expertise or executive expertise in scoring projects or opportunities, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And ultimately, the goal of everyone is to optimize their portfolio. So what mix of projects, mix of investments are going to deliver the biggest benefits to us? And that also involves cost modeling, estimating. So when you build that business case, the cost modeling, estimating is obviously going to be a big part of that. So I've said we're going to talk a little bit about challenges. Okay, so this sounds good. Now, why is it so hard to do for so many organizations? Well, it starts with there's a lot of disparate data and different data sources that you're going to need to pull in together in order to really do a good job of this. So there's a tactical component. So having tools or sometimes just spreadsheets or systems where you are managing your budgets, your forecasts, you're managing contracts in a different tool, you're tracking resources in another tool, you're measuring progress in order to manage or to run your day-to-day portfolio of projects that are in process. So there's a lot going on there. And then from the back from the top to the top down, you're doing capital planning, you're doing project selection, you're doing workforce planning, and then you're trying to pull all that together and analyze the portfolio. So you're trying to then ultimately take data from the tactical, understand what your current situation is, and then apply kind of a top-down perspective to identify where there's opportunities for either, it could be from anything from speeding up existing projects to hit key dates, to accelerating projects, to exceed key dates, to what projects can we work on next that provide us the biggest benefits. Oh, let me go back. Jumped a little too far. Sorry about that. And further breaking this down, so we talked a little bit about the kind of the silos from the tactical and the planning perspective. There's a lot of noise around that. So there are a lot of tools in place to manage those processes. So some of you may have one or more of these. So there's potentially multiple ERPs in a lot of cases, which are providing critical data into your capital planning process, but you're also managing your budget. Portfolio management software, there's portfolio management software out there. There's cost control software out there, contract management, and obviously scheduling software. And then you need to pull all this together and actually do some analytics in order to get the big picture and understand the big picture. So this is ultimately what a big challenge this is. This is why it's so hard to do. You've got all these disparate data sources, and you've got to pull all this data together so you can get something actionable, so executives can make decisions, or portfolio planners can make decisions on what the best way to go is. And often when you're pulling this in from different systems, and some of them may be manual and more Excel-like, estimating and budgeting spreadsheets, and then you're trying to pull in risk data and schedule data and commitment data, and by the time you get all this data together, the data is probably not current anymore. And so in order to really work through those scenarios, you're not always, it's difficult to be confident in your data. So that this is what one of the big challenges is. So, how do we bring some order to the chaos? I mean, ultimately, ideally, you've got some kind of hub where you're data warehouse, whatever it be, where you're pulling all that data together. And you need a connection between those two levels. So you can have a consistency in project planning and execution. So it is very clear to those working on the tactical level what projects are approved, what resources are assigned, what budgets are available. And then up from the tactical level to the portfolio level, you can understand what the actuals are. So how are you performing against plan, revising forecasts when necessary, and then you've got something actionable moving forward. So you can make some decisions when you do your portfolio reviews. So what does this give us? It gives us consistency in project planning and execution, which is kind of a holy grail for everyone. We'd love to be able to easily estimate everything, estimate schedules, estimate costs, estimate resources based on previous experience in projects. And as you start to gather some of this data in repositories where you can consume it, you can start to leverage that data in that way. You know, visibility into all project data. You know, too often, even with we all use SharePoint. We use SharePoint at HEXAGON, but there's multiple SharePoint repositories. It's still very hard to find whether that SharePoint or some other document management system. It's not SharePoint's fault. It's the users. You try to find all the data relating to a single project. It's really hard to do. It's hard to even find the people who know where to find all the data in many cases. And ultimately, you want to gain alignment. So you want to, again, we talked about this earlier on, and I'll beat that dead horse a few more times. You want alignment of the enterprise level strategy and day-to-day execution. So our day-to-day execution should be supporting our enterprise level strategy. And it oftentimes is not the case because it's not clear what's going on at the day-to-day from the strategic level, and it's not clear from the people working on the day-to-day specifically what the strategy is. Also, so this is what we're looking to achieve. So we'd like to have some common repository or some strategic enterprise-wide planning system that allows us to integrate the strategic and tactical. So have tools or methods of pulling all this together. And there are strong tools out there who do a lot of this, but I'll talk a little bit about integration later on. Ultimately, no tool is going to be the repository for all that. The data is not going to emanate from one tool. It's still going to be multiple tools, and it's kind of the 80-20 rule. So you pull in, you have 80% of the data you need in one place, and then you can integrate the rest. And also giving you tactical project controls and state-of-the-art analytics. So we've got the strategic, we've got the tactical, and then the analytics are going to give us some of the dashboards or views we need to support decision making. Okay, so back to the title of the presentation today. So how does a strong portfolio management process support changing direction? So kind of a little intro into that is, having a strong portfolio management process, if you truly do have a strong one, when a significant change in the market or in the world causes you to have to reevaluate things, that's what portfolio management processes are meant to do. Not only align with the strategy, grow the company, but they build in the ability to deal with and support change. So I'm going to just use a really easy, obvious example these days. So planning for change. I don't think anyone could have planned for COVID-19. At least I didn't see that coming. But by having a strong portfolio management process, I'm now going to talk about, okay, if you weren't able to plan for a change, how can you leverage portfolio management processes when you do have to change? So some examples, again, these are easy ones for all of us to see, I think, is transportation. So transportation has just been wrecked by the situation. So these are very recent studies in the last 3 weeks. This is from Deloitte. So there is a 30% decline in transportation revenue nationwide. I was almost surprised it wasn't higher, but that is brutal. And a specific example, North Carolina, the steep decline in revenue pushed them, their DOT, below the statutorily mandated cash floor. So they had to postpone more than 100 projects valued at $2.2 billion. So obviously that is significant. And there's another, actually, I'd encourage you to look for this. There's an interesting website that PwC's put together is talking about how COVID-19 is threatening continuity of projects. So they're, projects are now vulnerable, and it's causing concerns around long-term stability for some companies. But what can they do? What can you do if you're impacted in that way? So there's more than 3 points, but I picked the 3 that I thought were most relevant to my discussion today. So setting up a Tiger team, a small group of experts to take in all this data, analyze it, and then make decisions. Ideally, your portfolio manager would be on this team. Leveraging technology. So we're talking about technology today. I'm from a technology company and data analytics. So again, we've got all these disparate sources of data. How do we get all this data in one place and get it into a format where we can make sense of it, and so we can get some actionable decisions, sets of data to have actionable decisions. And then conduct scenario analysis. So that's another key component of portfolio management, and I'm going to dig further into that in the next 15 minutes or so. But so we obviously we can't predict what's going to happen a month from now. We can make some assumptions based on expertise. Ideally, we make different assumptions and model different scenarios. So you can make the best decision as to how to proceed on your portfolio of projects by looking at alternative delivery methods or alternative investment strategies. So where do we have the biggest opportunities that we can put in front of our planners, and then make the best decisions based on what set of assumptions line up the best with their thinking. So again, planning for change. So as part of your portfolio planning process, and this should be, when I talked about foreseeable events, these should be things that are you're planning for every year and you're discussing every year. So you're planning for these are long-term projects, but make sure as part of your planning process you understand what required maintenance, plant shutdowns, outages, refurbishments, upgrades are going to take place, because those are going to be necessary or regulatory needed from a regulatory perspective. So because those are going to eat up resources as well. So you need to have a good feel for that. What does the competitive landscape look like? Are there new players? Are there fast movers, people moving into your space? Are there spaces you want to go into? Understand your competition, understand where your strengths are, and understand where your weaknesses are, and be honest about those. Then you're going to always have competing priorities. So different people are going to have different priorities. There are some methods. I'm typically using various scorecarding methods, but as the next point shows, scoring is not accepted by a lot of organizational customers. They just kind of don't believe in it. It's subjective, and that's true. It is subjective. However, doing some strong cross-functional scorecards where you are using your subject matter experts or executives or portfolio planners. These are people that have done this for a long time. They have a good feel for how things are going to work, and so they actually can be quite useful, especially in evaluating projects, the next projects to work on, because it allows you to factor in things like strategic imperatives. If you've got alliances or partnerships, those can all wade into those kind of things. Where if you just look at a cash flow statement, that's not going to always give you the best answer. But that is how most people plan: is what are the financial benefits and what are my costs. So as I already mentioned, these are long-term projects. They're long-term. Changes in market conditions occur in the interim. So for some, the events this year might have just been a blip. I mean, not a good blip, but they may not warrant a pivot. For others, however, they may warrant a pivot, especially if there's a longer-term impact, or it may just be repurposing of funds from one project to another, or one market to another. So how do you do it? How do you do this, and how do you make these decisions? So now you're getting a little more about talking about, how do we align an evolving strategy with project execution? So we've talked about strategy and execution. How do you take into account, long-term capital projects with rigid and rigorous requirements, and using, strict project controls. Also pull in small projects that have to be planned, budgeted, but forecasted less rigorously. But nonetheless, it's important to understand what those needs are. Ultimately, what you want to do is improve your decision making. So make sure you're making fact-based selection and prioritization, making sure you've got the best data to do that. I talked about alternative investment strategies. So how do we create different strategies? Or I should say scenarios, and evaluate them against each other. Make sure you've got what you think is the strongest scenario that you're going to go forward with. But you can't just do that by guessing, going out and gathering the current data set, pulling that all in, because that can take weeks to do that, and then come back if you're not sure that that's the best strategy. You want to be able to do that quickly. Then ultimately manage those critical resources, so that whether it's financial, human, equipment, then make sure you're focused on, again, the projects that provide you the highest value, optimized for your constraints. And I haven't mentioned the complex ecosystem yet, but I think it's pretty obvious from when we were looking at from the tactical and the strategic. It is a very complex ecosystem. There are players within each of those pie pieces, and it's complicated getting all that data in one place and getting something that's actionable. So I'm going to give a quick example, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the process of changing your direction on your portfolio. So this is we recognize this pie chart here. So we've got approved project, we've got the tactical, we've got the strategic, and this is a really simple example. So you've got workforce capacity, and you've got allocated funds. And then we've got planned usage today for manpower and our funds. So this is where we should be today. However, due to what happens if after Q2 a project's delayed, which probably did happen for some of you. So our actual usage looks more like this. So we had problems or on some projects, but did that actual usage, so we've got workforce capacity and funds that aren't being used. What should we be using them on? Because you want to leverage that underutilization to move quickly, to do something else that will provide you a benefit. So you want better information in order to make quicker adjustments and better resource allocation. So you don't want unused capacity, because that's just lost dollars from a resource perspective. So let's break down the process of doing a portfolio review. So we talked about this at a high level. Now we're getting into a little more of the details. So it starts with doing projects and data collection. So you need to understand where you're at in order to make a decision about where you want to go to. So you would want to understand the state of your current projects. You would also want to understand the state of any opportunities or business cases you developed, or estimates. So projects that haven't been approved yet, but may have estimates and business cases against them. So you want to be able to pull that into a central repository and start creating scenarios. Those scenarios are going to be pushed down on by your constraints and targets. So those are going to be key inputs. And you're going to compare your projects and opportunities with your constraints and targets, and use simulation tools to start to identify what the outputs or what the benefits or costs are of each scenario. And you're going to make some decisions. You're going to compare those scenarios and start to make some decisions. So kind of that 4-step I talked a little bit about the 4-step to managing portfolios early. So planning, prioritizing, selecting projects or changing projects, and then repeat the process. So I mean, I think one thing from my perspective, having worked in portfolio management a long time, having a central repository and automation around that is critical for decision support and rapid response. Otherwise, I worked with DuPont years ago in their process, and they they did not have a central repository, and I know it took them 2 to 3 weeks just to gather data for portfolio meetings for their planners. And then oftentimes the planners may not have liked what they saw, or they wanted additional opportunities, or they wanted to look into different areas, and then the portfolio team would go back out and do that again. So very, very slow and cumbersome. So having some central repository where you can start to do some analysis is really important, in my opinion. So then it gets a little more, once you've got all this, as far as creating scenarios, you're basically, you've got your potential projects, and you should be evaluating those in a consistent way. Not by consistent, I don't mean everything should be evaluated in the same way, but they should, whether you have project templates or project types, those should all be evaluated in the same way. I mentioned scoring earlier. Again, I know that's there is organizational pushback against that, but there's a lot of literature out there on scoring and what value that adds. Again, it's just expertise of people who've been in the industry and have worked with these projects. So to make sure things align with, as I said, strategy, potential markets, and kind of pass the sniff test, because it's hard to do a business case that's going to be 100% accurate in advance, or a forecast. Then select your projects, your new projects, and then you move those projects into the portfolio. And the part of that process could be, especially from a change perspective, you may need to delay projects, you may need to cancel projects. I know that's not usually the case, but things may need to be reallocated. There could projects that are not going to be able to provide the expected business benefits. I mean, those are essentially sunk costs, and it's easier said than done. But making a decision to stop a project, if that project's not going to provide the benefits that were expected, may be the best decision. Again, I know it's easy for me to say. That's not very hard to do. So breaking that down even further. So standard scoring or evaluation. So weighted scorecards. Feeding into another key thing, having a balanced portfolio, making sure you are playing in different markets or different sectors, so you can balance that risk over the long term. Very, very important part of the strategic planning process, and also the portfolio review process, which follows well with this. So do interim reviews to make sure your portfolio follows your strategy. There may be times where your portfolio is not following your strategy, and you can make a decision that your portfolio is right and your strategy is wrong. But again, it's very important to be able to understand that and be able to analyze that and make the decision that you're going to change your strategy, and because what your portfolio is doing is the best for your company. But make sure you're all on the same page and that's communicated to everyone, because that's so important. And finally, making sure you have the financial and resource capacity to do that. So that's going to always be back to our targets and constraints. So we're going to always have those constraints we have to live with. Getting into the detail a little bit further. So, I've talked a little bit about the ability to support dashboards, but KPIs. So what are our prerequisites? We have to have our list of projects and opportunities. We should have some scoring, prioritization, and/or business case. So when I say scoring, I think scorecarding is a good way to do things, but I'd say the thing I see the most often is this prioritization, and that's the next best thing to doing scorecards. Having priorities clearly communicated is good enough for some companies. Understanding the business case, having defined KPIs, again, that are common, so that you can identify a risk on the horizon, you can identify how you're performing, and then give you the opportunity to pivot or change if needed. And then one thing I think that is maybe not talked about enough, there are must-do, or I like to call them must-do, but strategic projects. So projects that may not score the highest, and may not have the best business case, but they are critical from a strategic perspective. So it may be because of a relationship, it may be because of a future project that is dependent on that, but there are projects that are your executive team has agreed are key to moving forward on, because they're going to provide some future benefit. Let's move on from that. So promised to talk a little bit about the importance of integrated systems. So, so this is one way to look at it, having an integrated project controls tool, and then we've got all these different functions. So if you remember the pie charts earlier on, was one way of showing this, but a project controls tool where you have that's highly integrated with your ERP, your document management systems, progress tracking, change cost management, scheduling. So again, so you've got one place to pull all this data from. Project success rates are 4 times higher with fully integrated systems. So that's from the more tactical perspective, much less from the portfolio perspective when you're trying to model all these scenarios. This is taking a look at it a bit more as from a business process perspective. So this is what we looked at. This is just a different way of, I think, what we looked at earlier on. So having the key to having predictability and control and then making good portfolio decisions is pulling all this data into a single repository. And then you got to have the nice dashboards to support that. So getting into one place, getting all that actionable data for decision making is very critical for portfolio management. And I mentioned the ecosystem. I had the complexities around the ecosystem a little bit earlier. So just some kind of rules of thumb I've seen over the years, the keys to a connected ecosystem, support the life cycle, adopt and develop standards, have flexible business rules, and get everything into a single tool. Finally, I mentioned some of the dashboards. So these are just some examples of types of dashboards I've seen over the years. So having real-time actionable dashboards to allow you to create competing scenarios, compare benefits and drawbacks from each scenario. There's traditional portfolio type dashboards that you probably recognize here that are more strategically focused, and things like bubble charts, things like bar charts where you're comparing performance. But also for senior management, it can be useful to have more tactical portfolio dashboards to manage by exception. So to not have to go through detailed project lists, try to look, not sure where there might be risk or where there might be something that you're missing, but be able to have dashboards that will make it very apparent where you have issues. So where things are at risk, things are, you don't have a healthy project, and you can drill into that. And that's going to be part of the process, strong part of the portfolio management process. These projects are underperforming. Why is that? Do they not have the right resources? There could be a number of resources. And ultimately, you're going to want these to all look across the portfolio. All right. So with that, I think we've got a little bit of time for some questions today.
Okay, Mark. Yeah, we've got a question. In your experience, do you think that project engineers and managers are properly qualified and trained to undertake portfolio management, or is it just a learn-as-you-go experience through which portfolio management is learned and applied?
That's a really good question. I've kind of been there, so I understand. I would say typically they're not properly trained, but then they're thrust into the role to do that. I think it would be better. There are some good portfolio management courses out there. I mean, a lot of the content I've leveraged today, I've used over the past 15 years, and I've borrowed and noted where I borrowed it, but they aren't new concepts. So I think they're not typically properly trained and have to learn as they go. I think it would be much better if they did have the opportunities to learn some of these concepts and then introduce those back into their organization, because the executives are the people making the decisions. To be honest, they're not thinking about these concepts either. They're not process people. They're trying to advance their business. But by having a solid process and understanding what that is and what the benefits are, and having someone convey those, I think it would be better. I think it'd be a lot better if project managers and engineers had the opportunity to take some of the good training material out there.
Yeah, and here's one that's kind of related. We're seeing capital project stoppages or holds in the wake of oil price uncertainty.
Yep.
such decisions usually go through rigorous processes like the ones you talked about, or are they a little bit more based on fear, seat of the pants, boardroom whim?
I think it's, in my experience, it's more fear, seat of the pants. That doesn't mean those decisions are wrong, but I think what doesn't happen, because the decisions may be right, but it does appear to be, in my opinion, more seat of the pants. But I think maybe it's fine to stop those projects, but then, you know, what are you going to do with those resources? And there are a little overly simplistic scenario. I mean, those stop projects should provide opportunities elsewhere, hopefully. So what's next? And it would be better if there was additional analysis done on some of those projects before they were stopped. But if they're going to be stopped, what should we work on next?
Okay. On one of your early slides, you quoted somebody saying 36% and 19% in terms of performance. And the question is do you have more details about the data? For instance, the sample size, what the base was?
I don't,
for the measurement.
We can, so off the top of my head, I don't. But I think that was a study done by PMI. So we will make the slides available to all the attendees. So I can see if I can track that down before the slides are sent out. But yeah, it was a PMI study. Okay. That's a good question.
It sounds like integrating all of the disparate systems is a lot of work. How do you get started on a project like that?
It can be a lot of work. I think it's kind of the same thing as how do you eat the elephant one bite at a time. So or you know, we always default to the 80-20 rule. So you identify those systems or those data sets that are going to provide the most short-term value. And I mean, ideally, yeah, you don't want to do a 2-year project to do that because you're not going to get any value out of it right away. I mean, I think I've worked on projects where, you know, they've been more like 4 to 6 months where you're able to consolidate a lot of that data, you know, close to 80%. You know, you have your, let's say your project controls tools, you have your ERP, you have maybe pull a couple others in and get something rolled out to end users within 4 to 6 months, and then identify your priorities for what's next after that. But yeah, it's not a big, I don't think anyone's, I think the days of the big bang projects are kind of gone. We're not going to work on a project that's going to take 2 years to give some future value. Things move too fast. You need to get something today that gives short-term value, and then with a longer-term roadmap.
Okay. Your consideration of portfolios addresses the owner's perspective. Does portfolio management have any relevance for the contractor organization?
I do. I think it does. It's a little bit different, though. I mean, there's still decisions on where you're going to try to play as a contractor. Again, it's a little bit different, but what projects? I mean, do we have strategy about who we work with, where we want to demonstrate expertise in? So I think there is still a strategic play there. It always is going to come down to which projects are profitable and which are not, but I do think there's some opportunity to leverage portfolio management, the portfolio management discipline to take control of a market share or a market, and really dominate that, show the expertise, and become a leader in places. So I do think it is a little bit of a different thing, but I think there are room for making decisions about what projects you should go after and what you shouldn't.
Okay, great. You gave an overview of the practice. Is there a best practice for how to review or reevaluate the entire current capital plan when needing to make significant adjustments because of external shocks?
I believe there are some best practices out there. I think there are some. The CII content was very good. I would recommend taking a look at that. just from a capital plans perspective, that might be one of the better things I've seen. But I believe there's some more literature out there as well. I don't think there's necessarily any one best way to do it, but there are some definite best practices that were discovered in some of the studies done. So I would take a look at those. And in the deck, those are hot links too, so you should be able to get to them when you get the deck.
Okay. Got a question here. What is the level of detail needed in the attributes of each database, and how do you get basic training to understand what information needs to be loaded into the system, what to do with the data, and the outputs and the stakeholders that should be involved?
It's a great question, and it's not. I would, in my opinion, it's not as much data as you think to make decisions. I mentioned the work I did with DuPont about 8 or 9 years ago. So I was working with DuPont in the portfolio management space. It was the portfolio management for them included capital projects, but it also included R&D, which was big for them. And at the time, there were 12 businesses. I mean, this is before the DuPont Dow merger. They had 12 distinct businesses with different technologies that were pushing in each business. And working with the kind of the person who prepared the portfolio plan for the executives every year, I worked with him for about 2 years. He said they determined that, and they viewed themselves as the leader in portfolio management. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. They claimed they invented NPV. But they said they don't need for their executives more than 8 to 10 KPIs to make decisions at a high level. Whether that's an outlier or not, I can support that, having worked with a number of other customers. Having 40 or 50 attributes to try to make decisions on is not going to help anyone. You're never going to make any decisions. So it's a lot less than you need. Now, identifying what those right 8 to 10 are, or whether it's 15 or 20, I mean, that can be a little bit harder and take a lot of business process analysis in order to understand that. But it's not as much as you need.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a lot of work sorting out which ones are the critical few.
Yeah, absolutely.
But otherwise, you just choke yourself with too much data.
Yep. And go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm done. I was done with that.
Okay. What do you think about doing a complexity assessment of the project portfolio? Is that a valuable practice? When should it be done, and at what levels?
I do think complexity assessments are a good practice, because I think that gives you a lot of information quickly, and it does help. It does help you balance your portfolio as well. So that, I mean, in a lot of ways, that is a scorecarding method, doing a complexity assessment. So what I've seen is doing having different, what I like is having different levels of complexity assessment. So a higher level one, so fewer questions to answer early on in the opportunity assessment, and then maybe as you get through, come up to actually deciding to go forward with the project, maybe doing a secondary complexity assessment where you're going into more detail to uncover additional things. But I think the initial one is, I think both can be important, but you don't want to spend too much time in the early stages of an opportunity analysis. But at that point, just understanding, high, medium, low complexity for whatever your critical factors are can be very helpful.
Okay, great. At the end of the presentation, you showed some dashboards. What system did those come from?
Oh, those came from Ecosys. So that's the tool I work with as part of on the go-to-market team. So my role is a little bit of a combination of product direction, strategy, and sales enablement. But those are all coming out of Ecosys. But I mean, so we do have native dashboard capabilities, but we also integrate with dashboarding tools quite a bit as well. There's a lot of expertise out there in BI tools, so that it's and if our customers have, it's all about having the data, right? So whether you use Ecosys dashboards or you have another tool, or whether you have a data warehouse, it's all about having the nice views, but you need the data first.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Mark. That's all the questions we have, and we're running out of time. Hexagon and CII would like to thank you, the audience, for joining us this afternoon. Please stay safe, and we'll talk with you next time.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone, for attending.